12 years ago, I experienced a catastrophe that felt like a nightmare: an earthquake, a tsunami, and a volcanic eruption all at once in Mindo. This is my story of survival. It began when I was abruptly awakened by my bed shaking violently. Moments later, I heard the shattering of glass. Instinctively, I jumped out of bed and saw water flooding into my home. Living in a small village, I knew the emergency procedures for such disasters, but the situation was escalating rapidly. By the time I reached the door, the water was already up to my thighs, rising fast, and a shard of broken glass struck my face, embedding itself in my cheek. Blood poured down my face as I summoned every ounce of strength to pry the door open. I yanked out the shard, but just as I did, a wave propelled a broken tree branch into my chest, knocking me backward into the water. Struggling to regain my footing, I managed to resurface, gasping for air as the water reached my waist. I began to swim, desperately seeking higher ground, narrowly avoiding debris along the way. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed behind me. Turning around, I saw a massive wave swallow my straw house, its roof collapsing inward. The sight of my home being destroyed was devastating, but I had no time to mourn. I had to keep swimming, pushing toward safety. As I swam, something in the water caught my eye, a dark shape moving ahead of me. At first I thought it was just debris, but then it turned, and I saw its eyes. My blood ran cold as I realized it was a crocodile, right in the middle of what used to be my street. Panic surged through me, and I swam harder than ever before, my muscles burning and my lungs screaming for air. But the crocodile was gaining on me, and I knew I couldn't outrun it in the water. It was getting closer, and I was certain I was about to die. Then, out of nowhere, a boat appeared, like a divine intervention. The man on board, who looked as panicked as I felt, threw me a rope and pulled me aboard just in time. I collapsed onto the deck, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst. I had never been so scared in my life. Shaking all over, I managed to thank the man who had saved me. Once I caught my breath, I asked if he knew the full extent of the disaster. He shook his head, saying he had no idea, but that it was happening all over town. He had been rescuing people all morning, picking them up from rooftops, pulling them out of cars, doing whatever he could to help. He asked if I wanted to join him, and without anywhere else to go, I agreed. We spent the next few hours pulling people out of the water and getting them to safety. It was utter chaos. Some people were injured, others were in shock, and many were simply trying to comprehend the disaster unfolding around them. The fear and confusion were palpable, everyone driven by sheer survival instinct. As we worked, I noticed the man kept obsessively checking his phone. At first, I thought he was trying to get a signal or check for updates, but then I realized it was something more. When I asked him about it, he confessed that he was waiting for a call from his wife, who had gone missing during the flood. He was terrified that something had happened to her. My heart broke for him. Here he was, risking his life to save strangers, while the person he loved most was out there, possibly in danger. The worry on his face only made me more determined to help him. We began asking everyone we rescued if they had seen his wife. Each time someone paused to think, I saw hope flicker in his eyes, only to be crushed when they shook their heads. It was an emotional roller coaster, and I was right there with him, feeling every twist and turn. Finally, one of the women we rescued said she had seen someone fitting his wife's description. He asked for details. Was she wearing a red jacket? Did she have long brown curly hair, a brown purse, and a gold necklace? The woman paused, trying to recall the details, then confirmed that she had seen someone matching that description. The man's face brightened, and without wasting a second, he turned the boat in the direction the woman had indicated. We hurried through the debris, and soon enough, we spotted a woman who matched the description perfectly: red jacket, brown curly hair, gold necklace, and a small bag. The man rushed forward, calling out his wife's name, but when she turned to face us, his smile disappeared. She wasn't his wife, though she had all the right details. Her face was different. The man's hope shattered in that instant. He apologized to the woman, who seemed just as shaken. then turned back to me and continued our rescue mission, still holding on to the hope of finding his wife. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we found a group of people huddled on top of a building. Among them was his wife, injured but alive. She had a deep wound on her left leg and looked like she could barely stand. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw her. It was as if every ounce of fear and worry melted away. He ran to her, and they clung to each other like they'd never let go. We loaded everyone onto the boat and headed to a shelter on higher ground. By that point, I was beyond exhausted. My body felt like it had been through the ringer, and my mind was in shambles. But even in my state of exhaustion, I couldn't stop until I knew my own family was safe. The entire time, I had been pushing thoughts of them to the back of my mind, focusing on the task at hand. But now, with the immediate danger behind me, the fear hit me with full force. What if they hadn't made it? The thought was unbearable. When we arrived at the shelter, I practically sprinted inside, searching for them. I must have checked every room a dozen times, my heart sinking lower with each empty room I entered. And then, just when I was about to lose hope, I saw them. My husband and my kids were all there, safe and sound, huddled together in a corner of the room. I ran to them, and we collapsed into each other's arms. I had never felt such overwhelming relief in my life. I held them tight, terrified that if I let go, they might disappear. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. But just when I thought the worst was over, the ground beneath us shook violently. There was a deep rumbling, followed by a deafening explosion. Everyone in the shelter froze. We rushed outside to see what had happened, and my heart sank all over again. In the distance, a massive fire was spreading through the village. Flames shot into the sky, and thick black smoke billowed out, covering the sun. The explosion had come from somewhere nearby, and the fire was spreading fast. We couldn't just stand there and watch as the fire consumed everything. The man who had saved me earlier grabbed my arm and said, "We have to help. There are still people out there." He was right. Even though every fiber of my being wanted to stay with my family, to keep them safe and never let them out of my sight again, I knew we couldn't just sit by while others were in danger. So we gathered whatever supplies we could find from the shelter blankets, first aid kits, anything that might be useful, and headed back out into the chaos. Luckily, the tsunami had stopped, but the streets were still a war zone, flooded with water, and the fire was now our main concern. It spread rapidly, and the heat was so intense that it felt like my skin was burning. But we pushed on. We were determined to help as many people as we could. We worked tirelessly, pulling people from burning buildings, carrying them to safety, and doing whatever we could to prevent the fire from spreading. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Every time we thought we had things under control, another fire would spring up, or a building would collapse, forcing us to start all over again. And the whole time I couldn't shake the fear that my family was still in danger, that at any moment the fire could reach the shelter, and I wouldn't be there to protect them. But I tried to push that thought out of my mind. At one point, we came across a group of firefighters who were battling to contain the blaze. They were exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, but they were still fighting with everything they had. We joined them, helping to direct people away from danger zones and working to keep the fire from spreading to densely populated areas. But it wasn't enough. The fire was too big, and we were losing ground fast. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, one of the firefighters came up with a plan. He explained that the fires weren't just caused by the volcano but by a massive gas leak triggered by the earthquake and tsunami. The gas main that had caused the explosion was still active, fueling the fire. If we could find a way to shut it off, we might be able to stop the fire from spreading any further. It was a long shot, but it was our only shot. We had a mission ahead of us, so the man with the boat, a few firefighters, and I set off to find the gas main. The firefighters led the way, while the man and I followed closely, navigating through some of the worst hit areas. We dodged flames, debris, and the constant threat of collapsing buildings. I honestly wasn't sure if we'd make it out alive, As we scanned the area for any sign of the gas main, we turned a corner and found ourselves in what used to be a busy intersection, now reduced to a flooded wasteland. The firefighters jumped into the water and began searching, and then one of them shouted for us to come over. We rushed over to find a firefighter diving underneath the water towards a large, industrial-looking valve. This was the gas main, a massive tangle of thick pipes snaking through the ground, damaged and leaking in several places. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. This was the source of the fire. Without wasting a second, the firefighters got to work, using every tool they had to access the valve. The man and I helped where we could, lifting broken pieces of concrete and twisted metal. My hands quickly formed blisters, but we kept going. Finally, the debris was cleared enough for the firefighters to reach the valve. They signaled for us to step back as they prepared to shut it off. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, praying that it would work. One of the firefighters took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and then dove under. There was a moment of tense silence as he worked below the surface. We could see the faint outline of his body moving. 2 long minutes passed, and then we heard the hiss of escaping gas begin to slow, then stop altogether. The line was shut off. "We did it," one of the firefighters said with relief, but their expressions remained serious. Before we could celebrate, another firefighter reminded us that, although the immediate threat was gone, there was still a lot of work to do. We needed to secure the area and help the remaining survivors. I nodded, and we pressed on. The village was still in ruins, but for now we had won a small victory. The fires were finally extinguished, the waters were slowly receding, and the gas was no longer a threat. Entire blocks were reduced to ashes, homes destroyed, and the streets littered with debris. It looked like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. We were all exhausted, having been through hell and back, and it showed. Our clothes were worn out, our faces smeared with soot, and our bodies covered in cuts and bruises. Despite all that, there was an overwhelming sense of relief. We had made it through the worst of it and saved lives. That was what mattered. As we sat on what was left of a hill overlooking the city, there was a moment of silence. Then, the man I had been with turned to me and, with a tired smile, said, "We did it?" I couldn't help but smile back, even though my heart was still heavy from all the lost homes around us. In that moment, I realized that even though we had lost so much, we still had each other. It struck me then that I had gone on this entire mission with this man and didn't even know his name. I introduced myself as Miranda, and he revealed his name was Tom. In the days that followed, the village began to pick up the pieces. The damage was extensive, and it was clear it would take years to fully rebuild. But the community came together in a way I had never seen before. People who had lost everything found comfort in one another, and those who still had something to give, gave it freely. As for me, I knew I couldn't leave this place. As broken as it was, it had become my home. I couldn't turn my back on it now, not after everything we had been through. So I decided to stay and help with the recovery efforts. Tom stayed too. And we became close friends, working side by side to bring the city back to life.